God is not intimidated by the questions or the struggles or the doubts. Only people are.
From Interfaith Alliance, this is The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush in New York City.
I try to understand that, remember that God, whoever and whatever God is, would not be taken aback by my questions, so I keep asking them.
John Pavlovitz is a best-selling author of many inspiring and important books, and on April 2nd, he will add one more to that list. The book is titled Worth Fighting For: Finding Courage and Compassion When Cruelty is Trending. And I am looking forward to hearing all about this timely and touching call for kindness on this edition of The State of Belief.
I'm Roxy Stone.
And I'm Caitlin Beatty.
Saved by the City is a podcast from two Christian women cracking the code of faith from the mean streets of New York City.
Our podcast captures what happens when purity culture meets hookup culture, when distraction steals from devotion, and when the diversity of viewpoints and lifestyles clash against assumptions.
Gotham can be a weird place for Christian women, but we're out there, and we have stories to tell.
Saved by the City, wherever you get your podcasts.
Thanks for listening.
This is just the latest in our growing library of valuable conversations. Please make sure you're subscribed to The State of Belief podcast. Just visit stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You'll hear this episode in full, as well as interviews with Rabbi Danya Rutenberg, Jamar Tisby, Abdullah Antepeli, Catherine Stewart, David Gushy, Bishop William Barber, filmmakers Rob Reiner and Dan Partland, and many, many more. It would really help us to have you subscribe, rate, and tell people you're close to all about what you're hearing. The State of Belief is made possible in great part by the generous support of our listeners. If you've made a donation, thank you for helping get these conversations heard by more people who need them. If you haven't pitched in yet, information on how to do that is available at stateofbelief.com. And you'll find out more about the work of Interfaith Alliance and how to join us at interfaithalliance.org. And now to my guest. Reverend John Pavlovitz is an ordained pastor who lost his pulpit after taking an inclusive stance on LGBTQ persons. He is the best-selling author of numerous influential books with really good titles. One of them is If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk. Another one is A Bigger Table, Building Messy, Authentic, and Hopeful Spiritual Community. And Hope and Other Superpowers, a life-affirming, love-defending, butt-kicking, world-saving manifesto. His new book, coming April 2nd, is Worth Fighting For: Finding Courage and Compassion When Cruelty is Trending. John, welcome to The State of Belief.
Paul, thanks so much for having me. It's really good to be with you today.
Listen, I think there's something to a brave and clear book title. And I really like them. I really like what you do, because immediately you're signaling, okay, this is not a moment for virtue signaling or piety signaling. This is about like what we hope to be an honest conversation about religion, an honest conversation about spirituality with all of its messiness and all of I think sometimes we just think we have to be so sanguine or saccharine with our faith, but you're just like kind of slicing through that and saying, this is what this book is about. This is the adventure you're going to go on.
Yeah, and well, that's one of the benefits of having, in my case, an editor and publisher who really are behind the work that you do and want you to be who you are, and they didn't publish me begrudgingly, which I see happen many times with people who have really strong stances and they want to soften them. And for me, it is about letting people know this is a different kind of spin on spirituality, and hopefully it's something where people can find themselves where they are and just begin the conversation. I remember when If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk was coming out, someone said to me, why can't you just call it If God is Love, Then Love People? And I said, well, my aspirations for humanity have gotten very pedestrian. So I just want to start by doing no harm, not being a jerk. Let's start from there and see if we can go.
Well, and you're naming things that people are saying, they're just not putting it in book titles generally. Before we get into your latest book and some of the really important issues that it offers a guide to, I would say. Why don't you just tell us where you're from? Like, what's your background? How did you get to this point? Were you raised religious?
I grew up in central New York, a fairly traditional Italian Roman Catholic family. So I say I was raised on gluten and guilt, and I was really steeped in my faith tradition, and it meant a great deal to me. And slowly, as happens with so many people, when I got to the college years, I started to really explore the questions and lean into some of the tensions that I had, and really spend some time wandering a bit and feeling like, I guess, a hopeful agnostic at the time. And really, it was only about 27, 28 years ago when I was, my fiance at the time and I were looking for a church to get married in. So many churches wouldn't welcome us, or they just want us to take membership classes or to be a part of the community for a certain amount of time. And a small Methodist community, the pastor called us and she said, "Why don't you come down and see what we're about, and we can talk about your wedding." And I just fell in love with this community of people who were living out the teachings of Jesus in a way that I had missed. And so I started volunteering there to work with their teenagers and what I thought would be just, a little detour, a couple hours a week. And it was a huge detour because it was a pivot point moment for my life, and it just led me down the path to ministry, which was never something that I would have imagined. And so every day is sort of a surprise to me that all of this has happened.
Well, I love that story, and I think it really does indicate the winding path that so many of us take in faith. There is still this idea like, okay, you raised something, you married that way, you raise your kids that way, you die that way. But that's really not the story anymore. And it's certainly not the story in America, where there's so much heterogeneity of faith traditions. And so I want to just note, it shouldn't be something we have to note, but when you're talking 27 years ago or a little bit more, a woman pastor, we're still debating whether or not women should be pastors in some circles or have that spiritual authority. And it just already something was indicated there, and a welcoming was indicated there. And it's like, It's really nice to hear that story.
Well, Paul, what I marvel at is I was just going through some things in my attic, and I still have the Post-it note that has the pastor's name and the time that she told us for the service. And that simple yes by her, and it was eye-opening for me to be talking to a female pastor, and her just simple welcome, just what it did in our lives, and it changed the path of my wife and I's complete, trajectory of our lives. And then because of the writing and the speaking, so many other people have been impacted by that one person's simple, kind gesture. So that has always been a lesson to me as well.
Isn't it wonderful to really note the points and that connect the dots and see that there has been a journey? Whenever people are like, "Oh, what's your spiritual journey?" I'm always like, God, it's only that looking backwards that I can see it. Looking forward is always like, I don't know what's going to happen, but I can certainly identify the points where different people, and I love the way you said that. You said they said yes. And to say yes to someone who's seeking without knowing what the future of that relationship will be, but saying, okay, yes, let's have a conversation. Let's see where this can go. It seems to me that there's something operationalized about that in your writing, which is like the yes of the moment, and not always, not when it leads to danger, not when it leads to damage, but a certain yes to opportunities as they may come.
I think there is, looking back retrospectively, as you said, you see those moments. And so it's always given me great comfort in maybe the last decade of my life where I've been in this sort of public sphere, and to get up every day and say, I'm not sure where any of this is going, so I'm going to hold my convictions tightly, but the results loosely, and I'm going to be open to what's going to happen. There's a fearlessness that you have to have, I think, to really embrace a wide open spiritual journey. And so that's part of me, the lessons that I've learned is, and I want to share with people, is that when you leave sort of the rigidity of your old faith story and explore a little more, there's just this expansive world out there, and it's always a better place to be. So that's just a part of the way I do life now.
Yeah. And you can also experience, as part of that journey, you can go back and say, oh, there's such a richness there. Like, there's so many wonderful, for in your case, Catholic teachings that you can look back and say, oh my God, that, looking at, all of the saints, the new saints like Oscar Romero or some of the current wonderful Catholic leaders. There's so much to learn from our own traditions, even as we look out. I mean, one of the things I was really moved by, and I know you shared some of this, but I think it's worth talking about, is that, you've had your own difficulties during this time. And I'm thinking about, being diagnosed with a brain tumor. And I think a lot of times, especially for people who weigh into questions about religion and democracy, as both of us do, and religion and society and what it means, we also have this very personal wrestling that is happening that sometimes, folks miss as they see us largely as people doing public work. But talk about that personal journey and how it's part of your public witness at this point.
Yeah, Paul, that's something that really early on, I remember, I started to write about issues of faith in a way that I was writing as a pastor, but I was writing as a singular human being wrestling with some of these issues. And what I found was that people who were asking the same questions and feeling the same prompts, they started to find the writing. And when my father passed away about a decade ago, I remember just beginning to share that journey. I started writing, 3 days after he passed, and almost every day. And at first that felt very invasive and very difficult, but I wanted to let people in on that world and how I was experiencing grief in real time. And that turned out to be just such a gift, because it allowed me to use the trauma in my life to help someone else. And that was a lesson from the very beginning. I've always tried to share life with people as openly as I can, obviously within limitations. But the brain tumor diagnosis was another example of saying, I'm going to invite my community in and just see what happens. And the outpouring of love and kindness and people sharing their stories, that's what it's about to me. It's about using social media as a really direct relational tool. So it's not just passing on content, it's sharing life with people as well as you can.
It's such a good lesson for social media done well, which is really a social media, which is telling your story, finding ways not only to be producing and broadcasting, but also listening and being in conversation. When it's done it the best way, it can really be important that way. And I think something about losing your father or struggling with an illness is also a way to connect with perhaps people who may not immediately agree with you on some of the issues that you have strong opinions about, but are drawn to the kind of compassionate rendering of that story and feel that kind of empathy and connection, and that's really important, because it's very human. And I think that I just want to it's important to remember when we're in these really, really difficult moments, as I feel like we are right now, to try to find the humanity in one another, and I think shared experiences of loss, of struggle, of concern for the well-being of your family and friends. Those are all there. One of the things I would just like to take a moment is to tell us a little bit about what it was like to stand up in your congregation for LGBT inclusion, realizing that might create a moment of sacrifice for you.
Well, that was a realization that came rather slowly. I was in a mega church, and I was on the leadership team, very appreciated and well loved. And we had a community that was, although quite orthodox in some ways, was actually moving, and I could nudge that community. I had an equity of trust. I had sort of relational capital. And so as I was exploring some questions, I began to ask those of the people in our congregation. it was only when I moved to a new church and I didn't have that relational, time and didn't have that equity of trust that I felt the immediate resistance to some of the questions that I'd been asking. But it was really the 2 or 3 years of living in that tension between the person that I was feeling called to be the more I studied the teachings of Jesus, and the pastor that I was expected to be. So there was my personal journey, and then there's the collective weight of a pastoral position. And I knew that there were always going to be tensions the more I spoke clearly and explicitly. And so I knew that that day would probably come when I would be an authentic pastor or an employed pastor in this context, in the community where I was. And so I just kept writing until the moment when I knew this is untenable, and which turned out to be just a great gift to me, because the truth was, only when I was outside of that and I could speak fully, that's when the audience really found me, because I was able to speak the contents of my heart without, alteration.
Yeah, I mean, it is, it's very traumatic and difficult at the time, but sometimes you just need to go through that to be free and to recognize what your real calling is, which is writing and being in community. Let's talk about your new book, Worth Fighting For, Finding Courage and Compassion When Cruelty is Trending. So, my sense of this book is it's almost like you're extending a hand and saying, like, let's walk together. Like, I'm trying to, I'm not coming to you as an expert. I'm coming to you as a fellow pilgrim, and we are in a particular moment, and we need to walk together, and we need to, encourage one another, be there for one another, recognize we're not always going to be able to do what is, people hope that we'll do, but that we need to keep walking together. And it feels very much like that kind of invitation.
I appreciate that. And I'm glad. That's always been my intention. And it's interesting because you spoke about the idea of writing about grief and the health concerns being a place where you could meet people. And that's the challenge, isn't it? The more, as we talk about anything that touches religion or politics, invariably there are going to be passions that are, inflamed, and there is tribalism that begins to take root. And so the idea of the fight for me is to I've been looking at sort of those universal pressures that we all are under, whether that's fear, grief, loneliness, that those things are always sitting on our hearts, no matter where we are, no matter where we align politically and theologically. And so part of the book is asking, what is worth fighting for you, whether it's a relationship with someone that's been fractured by tribalism, whether you need to fight for your image of the church or of America, whether you need to fight for your own, emotional well-being. How do we do these things and do them with honor and with dignity? And so it's trying to go beneath the tribalism, but even knowing that those pressures are still going to be there. But it's trying to reach people, as you said, on a human level.
Yeah. Up next, more with John Pavlovitz. You can hear full episodes of The State of Belief anytime on our website at stateofbelief.com. You'll also find links to topics we discussed this week, as well as transcripts and more. And make sure you subscribe at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. You're listening to The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.
Hey there, curious minds.
Get ready to embark on a unique journey at the crossroads of money and religion with our new podcast, Money Meet Meaning.
The seductive effect of money, we think it can do the work that God does because there's something about money that does that. It's wild.
I'm Amber Hacker.
And I'm Tom Levinson.
Tune in for a blend of wisdom and levity as we decode the path to a more meaningful relationship with money.
I think giving, and this is a little crass, but I feel like it's the ultimate middle finger to money. It's liberating to give some away.
This podcast is your gateway to a vibrant and thought-provoking exploration of the interconnectedness of wealth and spirituality.
Join us as we unravel the surprising influence of ancient wisdom on modern finances.
Faith pervades people's lives and our society. And because money is such an important part of people's lives, exploring that intersection of faith and money, I think, is super, super interesting.
Get ready to be informed, entertained, and inspired to transform your financial outlook with Money Meet Meaning. Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to The State of Belief. I'm Interfaith Alliance President, Reverend Paul Brandeis Raushenbush. My guest is John Pavlovitz. His latest book, out April 2nd, is titled Worth Fighting For: Finding Courage and Compassion When Cruelty is Trending. It is interesting, the moment we live in, and I just have to mention something that is driving me a little bit insane. And so maybe you can be my pastor, or maybe we can just rant together a little bit.
Sure.
But I don't know if you saw the debut of the God Bless America Bible that has been released, and includes the Pledge of Allegiance and the King James Bible, and all these different things that are being kind of smushed together. In my mind, I can't really separate the God Bless America Bible with the sneakers, like the
Right.
kind of obscene gold and flag sneakers that any real sneakerhead is really is cringing from. But this feels just, it's one of those moments where you're like, oh my God, just when you thought things couldn't get, any more obscene, you see this kind of particular moment of, we use the term Christian nationalism, but it doesn't even cover all of it. I mean, it's like, it's a moment of almost idolatry of this idea that God has singled out America in the way that makes it particular over the rest of the world, and we're kind of fusing the Bible with this kind of idea of what America is. And help me get through this moment, because I'm really having some problems dealing with it.
Yeah, well, you and me both, Paul. I actually wrote a piece this morning about that, where I share excerpts from that Bible. They're excerpts that I've written, and they are antithetical to the gospel and to the scriptures. And so I published that this morning, and people were reading these really outrageous verses, and they were saying, I can't believe that they published this. And then I had to tell them it was satire, but they said it's so ridiculous now that we can't tell, because this seems unbelievable that someone would actually do this. And I think for people like you and me, people of faith, morality, and conscience are looking at a moment like that saying, may this please be the moment that some people wake up. And the discouraging part is those people who will not, who will somehow embrace this and do the theological gymnastics required. And so you're right, it's both laughable and grievous. And that's the sort of ridiculous nature of where we exist. We're looking at something that's farcical, but it's also doing such tremendous damage. So how do we even respond to it? And so it's a daily kind of challenge for someone like myself.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just that it's all wrapped up in kind of a huckster, like, buy this Bible. It's just, I don't know, it's unbelievable to me. And I think, it's just another one of those moments where you kind of wonder about our religious friends on the right who are just like, is this really what you want? Is this really your future of the evangelical church in America? And as someone who, has never adhered to that theology or was part of that group, I was always curious about, like, okay, there's inherent cohesion to the theology. I always felt like, okay, what they do have is a sense of, okay, they know what they believe, it holds together, and they're putting it forward. Again, I didn't agree with it, but I think we need some of that coherency. And this feels like it just has no integrity whatsoever. And it splits apart what I think the evangelical church in America felt like was its playing card. And so I'm just really dismayed by it. And it feels like just another low moment in the way that the white evangelical church in America has been kind of taken over by Trumpism and the religion of Trumpism, which is just really bizarre to me.
Yeah, you make a good point, Paul, that people don't make this distinction, but whatever this is now, it's not even the evangelical church. It is a cult of personality. And because people who grew up in an evangelical tradition, as you said, there was at least a worldview there, and that sort of made sense. And what you see now is something that is just so far flung from where it began that I think you look at people in the culture, people who are even curious about their faith, but even for people who are spiritual but maybe more to the left, I think they're having trouble because this exclusionary, predatory, bizarre expression of Christianity is getting the microphone, and it has the platform. And so to more and more people, that represents the totality of the Christian story. And so for people like myself, I'm always having to let people know there is actually an alternative expression of this that is far more compassionate and beautiful, and maybe you should investigate it. But that's getting more and more difficult for people to see because all they're seeing is this kind of malevolence.
Right. Well, it is worth just mentioning we're recording this in Holy Week, and I wonder what does Holy Week mean to you? Like, how do you understand this story that we're going through right now, and how it relates to your core beliefs about what Christianity has to say to society?
I think when I look at Holy Week, you see I've written a Lenten devotional and an Advent devotional that both speak to the complexity of the spiritual journey. That yes, there are these mountaintop experiences, there are these beautiful moments of birth, of resurrection, but they're always preceded by longing and suffering and grief. And I think so we look at Holy Week, and it's a perfect sort of metaphor for what we are going through, that there is this suffering and this violence, but yet knowing there are redemptive possibilities. And for people like myself, it's getting up every day and saying, what is the good that I can do? What is the empathy that I can offer? And I'll make that offering and trust in the results of it. But in the middle of it, it can be really difficult to look around and see what we're seeing and become hopeless. And the story of the scriptures for me is that, hope is this relentless thing that will not be diminished. And so for all of us, I think we always need a reminder just to keep going, even in this day.
I think I like the way you framed it, which is that Holy Week for Christians is, it starts out with a parade. There's a great hope that something might happen, and then you move into the commandment to love one another, right combined with the moment of betrayal. Yeah. and then the powers that be put Jesus to death, and there's a sense of devastation, of loss of your friend, of loss of your hope, and then what is the resurrection, which is for those of us who are Christian and who believe in the power of love to overcome hate, and even the power of love to overcome death. It's so the trajectory of the story is very it's a roller coaster of emotion, and I think when observed to its fullest, it is kind of a part of the life story. And I think that like Passover is like that. Many of the rituals in our religions do recognize all of the all of the emotions, and they're in some ways helping us to tell the story that we're living with in our life. And I don't know if you know this, I wrote a children's book and published it this year that was called Together We Rise, which is also about like the idea that the resurrection is not just for individuals to get their own, but it's an opportunity for the collective to celebrate one another and celebrate collective resurrection. So it was important for me to kind of put that together, and for my kids, but also to tell the story, and we're in that moment. So I'll wish you a happy Easter, and I wish all of our friends listening, whatever your story is and whatever tradition you may or may not be adhering to, we wish you just a life and hope and community. And I think I'll just, that was my little sermon there. You got Sorry, John.
That's great. I passed the collection plate. We'll be all set.
Like it or not, you got the sermon. Listen, but let's talk a little bit about like there's some really, really great pieces. This book that you have is made up of really like the great thing about it is you can experience a really great piece of writing that is maybe 3 or 4 pages long, not too long, and you can really stop and think about it and how it affects your life. Are there any of the particular writings that you think that you felt like were especially important that people know about as they approach the book, that feel absolutely crucial for the times we're living in America?
I think when it comes to the book is broken up into sections about the kind of fight that we're facing, whether you want to fight for your own emotional, spiritual health, whether you want to fight for a relationship with someone. And so what I love about the book is I think people can find themselves in it wherever they are, but the parts about the fighting with and for my faith tradition, so the part about Christianity is really important to me because it acknowledges that I have come through this tradition. I love it, what many things that I've experienced as a part of it, but I also see its toxicity. And so there's the honesty about the tensions of saying, I have a deep spirituality and I have an incredibly complicated relationship with organized religion. And so how do I do that work? And how do I follow Jesus' command to love the least and love my enemies who may be oppressing the least? And so there's a lot there that means a lot to me personally to express as a minister and as someone who's lived in this Christian story for most of their lives.
Yeah. You have one piece of writing called Progressive Christianity is Just Christianity, which is like, one of those, it reminds me of my great-grandfather, Walter Raushenbush, and he was ascribed this idea of the social gospel. And he really resisted using the term social gospel because the whole time he felt, I'm just writing about the gospel. Like, yes. I'm not, like, there is no social gospel. There's just the gospel. And that's what I'm writing about. And yet, in some ways to kind of say, this is progressive Christianity. This is, in some ways, like, makes it feel like it's a different tradition than a long trajectory of people believing and preaching in the way that feels relevant to people like you and I right now. This isn't like a separate idea. This is at the core. And, in this country, you look at the Black church often or some of the movements that have been so important to moving our country forward. And they weren't progressive Christians. They were Christians who were working out of their the core of what they view as their faith. The other piece that I think is just really interesting and comes up all the time is this grief that people feel about how they've lost members of their family and lost friends over this moment of politics, and where like people can't talk to one another. It's really heartbreaking. I've had people like really when we've been around the country doing trainings, they're like, I feel like I've lost my family. And I don't have a good response for that because it's very real. And I'm not sure I remember it ever being quite this bad, where people just now, I mean, but I haven't lived that long. So, I'm sure it has been. But any thoughts about this?
Doing the work that I do, I call myself a collector of stories, a war correspondent, and that I get to travel to all these different communities and get into the trenches with people, and I ask them questions, and then they share what's happening in their lives, and then I report back through the writing. And that has been the constant thread for the past 7-8 years, is this incredible grief, and it's a accumulated grief. So often, the natural way is we might lose a person to death, and we might grieve that one event and process it. But this is an accumulated grief. So we're grieving something we're seeing on the news about immigration, and we're trying to process that. And the next day it's a mass shooting, and then we're grieving, something happening at the border. And so we never get to fully process anything. And then we've got these relational griefs that have come through the political tribalism and the pandemic. And that is the place where this is not just abstract theology or politics. This is relational fracture, and this is where it all leads to. And so that's where my writing tries to reach in to those very personal, smaller spaces. And that's the real story here. And I think the only answer, I tell people we're always in the tension between our convictions and our relationships. There are going to be times when we have to fight for one as opposed to the other. And I think we're all trying to figure out the balance there.
Yeah. And I think, you also talk about, like, sometimes you just don't have to put yourself in harm's way in order to do, people are always like, well, actually we had an amazing conversation last week with two abuse survivors, sexual abuse survivors, who have a new book out called Surviving God. And this idea, you always have to forgive. You always have to go back and be in relationship with people who are really harmed you and continue to harm you. And that's just not true. But knowing, like, the balance of that and being able to discern that, it's just so important in this moment. And, it's interesting how, one of the things you talk about is the messy table. And I think that's actually, like, you gave a really vivid illustration about a table where it ruptured, and you were, but some important things happened. What is the messy table metaphor for you?
I think when we found ourselves in genuine community, whether that is a healthy family system or a faith community or a social group, when we know that we are going to be received with a posture of curiosity and respect, and we may differ, and we may actually have knockdown dragouts at times, there is a respect there that allows you to be authentic and know that there won't be a lot of deal breakers. And so that's where I think religion, when it works at its best, spiritual community will hold a great deal of difference. The challenge is dealing with the community when it's not healthy, when it's a family or a church, that their response to difference is pushing people to the periphery immediately or removing them altogether. And so that's where the tribalism seeps in. But I think there's always possibility to expand what spiritual community can and should hold. They should be places where we can be our most authentic selves. And because, as God is not intimidated by the questions or the struggles or the doubts. Only people are. And so I try to understand that, remember that God, whoever and whatever God is, would not be taken aback by my questions. So I keep asking them.
I mean, the Bible is full of questions. Just look at the Psalms. It's a constant question, and also accusations against God. I mean, believe me, if God was fragile,
that's right,
God would be already busted, because, like, the major text, Jesus on the cross, you know, I mean, my God, why have you forsaken me? I mean, so I just think, like, a faith that doesn't allow questions, or a church that doesn't allow questions, watch out. Because that is a potentially, it's authoritarianism. You have a piece of writing called The Myopia of Christian Nationalism. Say a little bit for our listeners what you address in that, because, they hear me talking about Christian nationalism a lot, but I think it'd be helpful to hear your voice on this.
I think that one of the most revealing parts about a theology that is not confident in itself is that it needs something to survive. And in the case of Christian nationalism, what Christian nationalism requires is an adversary. It needs an encroaching enemy. It needs a danger that's coming. And because the engine that thing runs on is primarily fear. And as we talked about, fear is universal, so it can tap into people's phobias and prejudices. So what Christian nationalism does is say, you are right to be terrified of your neighbors and people who are different than you, and historically marginalized people. They're somehow a threat to you. And then say, and we can protect you. And so it gets people, I always say no one is at their best when they're terrified. And Christian nationalism is really built on a group of people who are afraid of God, they're afraid of hell, and they're afraid of their neighbors and really everything. So there's a war posture that's always required. And where you have the Sermon on the Mount, which is fueled by empathy and the loving of the other, it's just such a disconnect. So I'm constantly trying to lift up those two things and ask people if they feel like part of the same thing, because to me, there's no relationship to them anymore.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Fear is the operating principle there, but also a certain kind of pride of feeling one at the center of what really matters. And I think that, that is just like kind of claimed that if I believe this, if I'm a part of this, I'm somehow, by just that stating that's who I am, I have a certain pride. And if you're assail it, then that feeds into the fear, and it leads again into kind of a fighting stance. And so I do think it really is one of the great heresies of the Christian faith right now. And I think I applaud a lot of our colleagues who are doing so much against it, yourself, but also groups like Christians Against Christian Nationalism, like Vote the Common Good. A lot of folks who there's lots and lots of Faith Matters. There's a lot of great folks out there who we are working with. But I especially those who are working from the Christian position. We are more of an interfaith organization, but those who are working from a really Christian stance, who are saying, listen, like, you don't have to be fearful. You don't have to be in this to have a strong faith. And I think that as much as possible, it's really important that we continue to reach out. And I think there's some good people who are doing that right now.
Yeah, well, you touched on something that's really the sort of arrogance that really ties into something we talked about just a second ago, which is being afraid of the questions, because in those environments, certainty is sacred and doubts and questions are seen as moral failings. And so if you can say, I believe this and I don't question it, then you feel very righteous doing that. When in actuality, the stronger faith perspective is bring every question and I'm okay with them because my faith is big enough to handle them. I've found that doing this work over the past decade in a very public way, I've been invited to speak by progressive Christian churches and mainline churches and mosques and synagogues and humanist conferences and atheist events, but I've never been invited by a single conservative evangelical church. And I think that's just because the sense of wanting to control the narrative and not allow people to think critically, that's very revealing to me.
One of the things that we feel is so important at Interfaith Alliance and a lot of our colleagues is like, we're not just fighting against something, we're casting a vision for a future that we're working towards. So, we're talking about questions, but questions can also lead to a kind of collaborative answer about a solution that works for everybody. And I think that it's really important, as I go around talking about the world and talking about America, really recognizing we have a lot of work to do to build the community that we hope for, to work towards the beloved community that King talked about. But we're not just working against something, and we're not looking backwards. We're really looking forward to building a beautiful, equitable, multiracial, multi-religious, multi-background country where all are respected and treated with dignity. And this is a big part of it. And towards the end of your book, you turn towards that. Like, really, what is it? What's the future we're imagining? Yeah. So that we all might recognize we're not just in a defensive stance, but we're actually imagining a future. Do you want to talk a little bit about how important that is in moments like this when we feel like we're that's also something worth fighting for?
For sure. And we mentioned progressive Christianity earlier, and doing this work, when I got some public notoriety, it was immediately, well, this guy is one of the voices for progressive Christianity, and I never really wanted to be that. And I try to tell people I'm just the voice of myself, a flawed and failing human being who's trying to figure this all out. And I know that the path forward is with more voices. It's always going to be with greater perspectives, and interfaith is always going to be the better version of humanity and an interdependent community of those people. And so that's where I see the hope, because doing this work, it's been amazing because the words just do their work and they reach the people that they're going to reach. And I've been fortunate to have this really disparate, odd congregation of people, and they're believers and they're former believers, and they're struggling, or they're completely against religion, and yet they're finding those places to gather and to have commonality and to do something with their sort of shared affinity. And so that's the encouraging thing. I think, we can lament the internet and social media and the ills of that, but the beauty of it is it's shrunken the world down so that we can have all these perspectives and have these relationships, and that's what encourages me.
Yeah, I think it's really important, and that's a great. I end the show every time with what gives you hope, but it sounds like you've just answered that really it's about the community that can be built and that can find one another and continue to grow together. And that feels like really valuable. And I think it's a lesson, a reminder about the internet. Is like the internet is what we make it. You can doom scroll, and you can just dive into the troll and let the troll guide your conversation and the way you act. Or you can really look for one another and find one another. And, I've known your work for about 10 years, and I found it on the internet. And a lot of my life has been on the internet with BeliefNet and then HuffPost Religion and other platforms. It's been a huge part of the way I've understood myself as a person, as a minister. So, the internet is incredibly complicated, but I urge our listeners to imagine how you are interacting with the internet right now in this important time, and finding people who are helpful for you. And I think that I'll lend on that. This was another really important part of your book, is find people who give you hope, find people who lift you up. You don't always need to be surrounded by the problems. You can really surround yourself with a community of love that supports you, that will lift you up in the darkest times. And so, just tell the listeners about that, almost as as part of our Holy Day celebration.
Well, I think I'm always looking at what I would call energy orientation. So sometimes I'm fighting systemic injustices, and I'm pushing back against legislation, and there's a necessary battle posture there, and I'm on the offensive. But I want to make sure that I'm also taking time simply to live in diverse community, doing beautiful redemptive work alongside people who are different than I am. And so you balance those things. And so I think for the people who are listening, people who are watching, just to go out into the world every day and say, let me do something that fights injustice, and let me do something that loves humanity, and things will work out in the end. I just have to trust in that. And millions of good people do that every day, that's how we wake up in a better world in a few years.
John Pavlovitz is the best-selling author of books like If God is Love, Don't Be a Jerk, and A Bigger Table. You can subscribe to his Substack, The Beautiful Mess, where he also posts a bite-sized, almost daily podcast. Follow Stuff That Needs to Be Said blog, and find out more about the Empathetic People Network at johnpavlovitz.com. And I'm going to spell that for you because I'm nice. JohnPavlovitz.com. John's brand new book, coming April 2nd, is titled Worth Fighting For: Finding Courage and Compassion When Cruelty is Trending. John, I know our listeners will get so much from this conversation. Thank you for being with us today on This State of Belief.
Paul, thank you. It was a great joy to be with you.
At this time of year, I look around and I talk to my friends and my neighbors, and I am constantly amazed and so grateful for the rich religious diversity that we are experiencing right now across the board. It is really wonderful. It's springtime, and so many different traditions observe that in different ways. While Ramadan is happening, we're in the middle of Ramadan, and so our Muslim friends are fasting or observing Ramadan, and Eid is coming up in April. We're taping this right now in Holy Week, and so many of us Christians are in the middle of that most sacred time of year. We have Purim and Passover coming up with our Jewish friends. In the Sikh tradition, there are holidays. In the Hindu tradition, and also in the pagan tradition, there are many different amazing holy days happening right now. And what makes it especially wonderful is that this country welcomes people of all backgrounds, that we can look around and our neighbors, our friends are experiencing life and its richness in different ways. I want to lift that up today as a great benefit to our country. Unfortunately, there are some who want to insist that one tradition is more important in this country than another. And unfortunately, there are some who are saying this country is a Christian country, and by that they mean a kind of a straight white Protestant Christian country made in their image. But that's just not true. It's welcoming for all of us, people with diverse religions and beliefs, including those who have many beliefs but are not part of any religious tradition. And the important thing I want to say today is how beautiful and grateful I am to all of you, and how I want to stand up for your rights and your dignity and your freedom to be and believe who you are, right next to someone who believes and is in a way that is very differently. We are trying to do something new in this country, and it's such a beautiful experiment. And let's make sure that we stand up for one another and make sure that together we create this amazing country where all people can believe as they believe, live as they want to live, and be treated with equal dignity and respect. And out of the many, one, e pluribus unum, we the people are going to create this country, this diverse religious country together. So happy holiday, whatever that is, and I'm glad to be celebrating it alongside you. Please be sure to subscribe to The State of Belief at Apple Podcast or your favorite podcast platform, or at stateofbelief.com/subscribe. We need your help to keep making The State of Belief. Become a partner in this crucial work with a financial contribution today. Information on how to donate is available at stateofbelief.com. That's stateofbelief.com. And share what you're getting out of this show with the people in your networks. Let's get more people listening and keep these conversations going on Facebook and Instagram at State of Belief. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of Religion News Service or Religion News Foundation. The State of Belief is produced by Ray Kirstein and is a production of Interfaith Alliance. Become a member today at interfaithalliance.org. And be sure to join us next week. I can't wait. Until then, I'm Paul Brandeis Raushenbush on The State of Belief, where religion and democracy meet.